Welcome back, everyone. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at the Age of Empires games.
Yeah, the Age of Empires universe.
Specifically, a lot of you have been asking about Age of Empires 4, some of the differences between that and, the other games in the series, particularly Age of Empires 2, and why Age of Empires 3 sometimes feels like it's, I don't know, maybe not getting as much love.
Right. Yeah, and we've got some interesting sources today to kind of dig into all this. We've got forum discussions where players are really going head-to-head on comparing these different titles. We've also got an article from Age of Notes, which is taking more of a data-driven approach, looking at player bases and what's driving some of those preferences. And then we'll round it out with a video from Spirit of the Law on YouTube. And he's coming at it from the perspective of someone who's been a long-time Age of Empires 2 enthusiast. So.
Yeah. So between all of those different perspectives, I think we can really get a good picture of what was going on with the community and what they were hoping for with Age of Empires 4, and also try to understand why Age of Empires 2 continues to have, so much attention from Microsoft specifically, sometimes even maybe at the expense of Age of Empires 3.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in and start with Age of Empires 4. There was definitely a lot of anticipation leading up to this game. I mean, just looking at this forum thread here, one of the players was describing it as having the potential to be, the best graphics, the best animation and sound effects, even the best overall game mechanics, and they were talking about things like scaling walls and pouring boiling oil, which we hadn't really seen in previous Age games in that way.
Right.
And they were really excited about the Age Up mechanic too, where you build these special structures called landmarks, and that adds this whole other layer of strategy.
Yeah.
And the player even said that it would have the most unique and distinct factions, taking the best elements from both Age of Empires 2 and 3. So really painting a picture of a truly evolved RTS experience.
Yeah, I mean, you can see why people were so excited about it. The prospect of taking that classic Age of Empires 2 gameplay loop and then giving it some of the innovation that we saw in Age of Empires 3 and then wrapping it all up in this really nice, modern, visual package. It makes sense.
Yeah.
That forum user even mentioned some really cool unit abilities like, longbowmen setting down defensive stakes and knights using a charging lance attack. So there was this expectation of a lot of depth in the tactical options, even at the individual unit level.
But of course, as we know, sometimes what you imagine a game to be and what it ends up being can be two very different things.
All right.
And in the same forum thread, actually, some players were pushing back a little bit on some of these claims. For example, that idea that it would have the best graphics. Some people felt that Age of Empires 3 actually had more detailed animations, and that really added to the immersion.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were pointing to things like the artillery being pulled by teams of animals, which made it feel like, really heavy and realistic. And even just small things like the horses moving around in the stables.
Right.
It made the settlements feel much more alive, and they also preferred the maps in Age of Empires 3. They felt they were more lively with features like trade routes that you could actually see and native settlements that were sprinkled around.
Yeah, I think that raises a really interesting point about how we define best when it comes to graphics. I mean, clearly, Age of Empires 4 has, higher graphical fidelity in terms of like resolution and just the complexity of models. But some players felt like it lacked that same level of detail and almost like environmental storytelling that Age of Empires 3 had.
Right.
Those little touches that make the world feel more believable.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about the visuals. There were also questions about how unique the factions in Age of Empires 4 really were compared to Age of Empires 3.
Mm-hmm.
The original poster in that forum thread thought that faction distinction was going to be a big selling point, but other players weren't so sure.
Yeah, I mean, Age of Empires 3 did a lot to really differentiate its civilizations, especially when you look at the expansions that brought in the Native American and Asian factions.
Yeah.
They had completely different ways of playing the game.
Yeah.
Unique mechanics and units that went beyond just having slightly different stats.
Right.
So maybe for some of those veteran players, Age of Empires 4, while it has its own unique elements, maybe it didn't feel like as big of a leap forward in terms of faction diversity.
And there was the sense, too, that even though Age of Empires 4 had a modern game engine, it wasn't being used to its full potential when it came to creating these really dynamic and visually interesting maps.
Interesting.
Yeah, players felt like the environments were kind of static and lacking in detail and that it kind of took away from the experience. Now, if we switch over to Reddit for a minute, this thread we're looking at kind of echoes some of those same sentiments.
Okay.
It seems like Age of Empires 4 was trying to be this sort of hybrid, mixing elements of both Age of Empires 2 and 3.
Yeah.
But definitely leaning more towards Age of Empires 2 in terms of the core gameplay.
Right.
For example, they got rid of the deck system, which was a huge part of Age of Empires 3, and brought back things like dedicated resource drop-off buildings, and the tech trees felt pretty similar to Age of Empires 2.
Yeah, that's a pretty big clue that the developers might have recognized that people really loved the core mechanics of Age of Empires 2
Yeah.
and wanted to stick closer to that formula.
Yeah, and it seems like they made the right call in a lot of ways.
Right.
But the Reddit thread does point out some of the things that Age of Empires 4 does differently, like the civilization-specific mechanics that really change how each faction plays. You know, they've got the landmark system for aging up, which forces you to make these strategic decisions about how you want your civilization to develop. And they've added walkable walls, which makes sieges a lot more interesting. You can burn down buildings, which is a cool tactical element.
Right.
And they've got stealth forests where you can hide units and ambush your enemies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And they've also toned down the micromanagement a bit compared to Age of Empires 2.
Interesting.
So you don't have to be clicking on individual units every second, you know?
Right.
That makes it a little more approachable for people who are new to this series or new to RTS games in general.
I can see that.
But on the other hand, there are some criticisms of the game as well.
Okay.
Like one of the users in this Reddit thread just straight up called it soulless.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they specifically mentioned things like the unit icons being kind of generic and the campaigns not being very engaging.
Ouch.
Yeah, I mean, it is a pretty harsh critique, but I can kind of see where they're coming from sometimes. When you try to update a classic game, you can lose some of that magic.
Right, that intangible quality that makes it so special.
Yeah, exactly, and the visual presentation is a big part of that. You know,
Yeah.
if you can't quickly tell what units are on the battlefield or if the campaigns aren't interesting, then it's hard to get invested in the game world.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So let's shift gears now and talk about why Age of Empires 2 is still so popular and why Microsoft seems to be putting so much effort into supporting it.
Okay.
This forum discussion that we were looking at before really breaks down the reasons.
Yeah.
People are saying that it's very simplistic and easy to learn and master, but at the same time, it has this incredible depth of strategy.
Right.
It's also considered to be the most balanced game out of the three main titles and the best for competitive gaming and tournaments, you know, like the Red Bull Wallow events.
Yeah.
And they even say that it's easy for players to adapt to if they're coming from Age of Empires 3 or 4.
That's really interesting because even though it's the oldest game in terms of its core design, it seems like Age of Empires 2 just hit on something that's timeless.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the modding community, which is absolutely massive.
That's right.
I mean, they've got these huge overhaul mods that completely change the game.
Yeah.
Tons of custom campaigns that players have made.
Oh, yeah.
And even this crazy Return of Rome expansion that basically brings all the content from the original Age of Empires into the Age of Empires 2 engine.
That's right. And then there's the sheer number of civilizations. They've got almost 40 now with all the expansions.
Wow.
So there's just a ton of variety in the gameplay.
Yeah, it's a lot of options.
And the Age of Notes article really gets into why Age of Empires 2 is still on top.
Uh-huh.
They say it's all about the sophisticated strategic gameplay, the well-balanced civilizations, and that incredibly dedicated community.
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
And they break down the reasons for its popularity even further, starting with the fact that it's just really accessible. You know, it runs smoothly on pretty much any computer.
Right.
Which is a big deal these days when so many new games require you to have the latest and greatest hardware.
Yeah, that's a huge barrier to entry for a lot of people. So the fact that Age of Empires 2 can run on older machines means that way more people can play it.
Exactly. And it's not just accessible in terms of the hardware requirements. It's also relatively easy to learn the basics.
Uh-huh.
But underneath that accessible surface, there are all these deep game mechanics, like terrain bonuses that can affect how your units perform, and a complex system of unit counters that rewards you for understanding the strength and weaknesses of each unit type.
You can pick it up pretty quickly, but there's always more to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And the balance and diversity of the civilizations is another big factor.
Right.
The article points out that almost every civilization in Age of Empires 2 has access to the same basic unit types.
Yeah.
So you're not at a disadvantage just because you picked a certain civ.
That makes sense.
And when a civilization does lack a standard unit, like the Spanish not having crossbowmen,
Right.
they usually get a really powerful, unique unit to compensate, like the Conquistador. Yeah, so it makes for these really interesting matchups that are generally pretty fair. And of course, you can't discount the nostalgia factor.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, Age of Empires 2 was their first RTS game, so they have a lot of fond memories of it.
I can definitely relate to that.
And the historical campaigns are great too, because they teach you a little bit about history while you're playing.
It's like edutainment.
Yeah, exactly. And even though the graphics are 2D, they're still really clear and easy to understand,
Yeah.
which is important when you've got these big battles going on with tons of units on the screen.
You don't want to be squinting trying to figure out what's happening.
Right. And the amount of content that they've released for this game over the years is just insane.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there are countless official and community-made maps and campaigns, a huge modding scene that's always coming up with new stuff,
Wow.
and a steady stream of DLC expansions that keep the game feeling fresh, even after all these years.
It's amazing how they've managed to keep it going for so long.
Yeah, and then you've got the whole streaming community with big names like the Viper T90 official and Hera. They're always drawing in huge audiences.
Yeah, they're really entertaining to watch.
And the competitive scene is huge too, with major tournaments like Red Bull Wolo that get a ton of viewers.
It's like a whole ecosystem built around this one game.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all self-sustaining.
Yeah.
You know, the streaming and competitive scenes are constantly generating new strategies and keeping people engaged.
Right.
And the fact that Red Bull Wolo still gets so many viewers even today shows you how much staying power Age of Empires 2 has.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Now, Spirit of the Law on YouTube, he makes a really interesting point about the player base for Age of Empires 2.
Okay.
He says it's been significantly larger than the player bases for Age of Empires 3 and 4 pretty much since the beginning.
Interesting.
And he also talks about how accessible Age of Empires 2 is. He says it's just as deep strategically as Age of Empires 3, but it's much easier to learn.
Right. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the comments on Reddit, you see a lot of people saying the same thing.
Uh-huh.
They call Age of Empires 2 the classic,
Mhm.
you know, and they talk about how the HD edition really revitalized it.
Yeah,
And they see it as a natural evolution from the original Age of Empires.
that makes sense.
And the fact that Microsoft released a definitive edition of Age of Empires 2 shows you how much they're still invested in this game.
Yeah, it's clearly their flagship title in this series.
So to sum it all up, it seems like people had really high hopes for Age of Empires 4.
Yeah.
But it hasn't quite lived up to the hype. There are questions about whether it's really different enough from the other games and whether it's been executed as well as it could have been.
Right.
But Age of Empires 2, on the other hand, it just keeps going strong.
Yeah.
It's this perfect combination of accessibility and strategic depth. It's got an amazing community, and it's got this legacy that goes back decades.
It's a tough act to follow.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's why Microsoft keeps putting so much attention into it.
Makes sense.
Now, this all brings up a really interesting question for you to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about how players want innovation, but they also want familiar mechanics.
Right.
And we've talked about how technical limitations can affect accessibility. So, given all of that, what do you think are the most important factors that determine whether an RTS game is going to be successful in the long run?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think it's a complicated mix of things.
Yeah.
You know, the gameplay has to be fun and engaging, of course,
Yeah.
but also has to be balanced and fair, and the game has to be accessible to new players without alienating the veterans. And then there's the whole community aspect, you know.
Yeah.
If you can build a strong community around a game that can really help it to thrive for years and years.
Absolutely.
I think if you're interested in exploring this further, you should definitely check out some gameplay videos of all 3 Age of Empires games.
Yeah.
And maybe spend some time reading through the community forums and see what people are talking about. And, you know, the great thing is that all of these games are still being updated with new content, so there's always something new to discover.
That's right. So if you haven't tried them out yet, now is a great time to jump in.
Yeah, and, you know, even if you've played them before, there might be something new waiting for you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
Then we'll see you next time.